stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker of Elkins Consulting. Whether we're sharing business stories or personal stories, how we share them makes a difference in how we remember them and in how we're being perceived by the people we're sharing them with. Think about a story someone recently told you. What did that story say about the person sharing it? Did it demonstrate a different aspect of their character than you were expecting? How we choose to share a story, those details about the characters, our body language, our facial expression, and tone of voice, all contribute to the perception our audience will have of us afterward, and in our internal messages. If you're ready to explore your own stories and find your patterns and pivot points, I can help. My book will be available for pre-order on August 1st, because your story isn't a timeline of experiences. Your story is each individual incident, conversation, and event that made an impact on how you think and how you see the world. This book will help you identify those incidents and help you create a story portfolio to refer to as you choose which personal stories and how to tell them. And when you can look back at that portfolio and find patterns in your life, you can address many of those internal messages and communication challenges that are limiting your success at work and in your relationships. Visit my pre-order site on publishizer.com, click on Proposals, and search for Sarah Elkins or Your Stories Don't Define You, or visit my website, elkinsconsulting.com, to learn more. I'm recording this podcast today with a woman named Caroline Mays that I met through, I think it was Marietta Gentles Crawford, who shared your video that just completely inspired me, and I couldn't not reach out to connect with her. So welcome to Your Stories Don't Define You, Caroline.
Thanks so much for having me, Sarah.
I always start the podcast by asking my guests to share something about themselves that most people wouldn't know about you, that you wouldn't see on a bio or your LinkedIn resume. Partly because I like to give some context for our listeners so they have just a little bit of a connection to you before we start digging into more personal stories.
Okay. I thought about this and I was like, oh man, the irony here is that I'm such a fiercely private person. I was like, and as a bio writer, right, like that's always such a challenge to figure out what we're going to say. But it's funny, I wanted to share that this is my third business that I've ever had. And my first one, this is kind of funny, was a bit of a ruse to get out of a corporate job that was so underwhelming to me. And I started a dog walking business. Like in my late 20s, like I can't do this anymore. I'm just like, I'm going to get out of like marketing and I'm going to get out from behind a computer. And it was, anyway, just something that I did for a little while, pros and cons, but yeah. And my second one was, this wasn't a full-time gig, but it was intaglio printmaking. So I have a bit of an art background. And so anyway.
Wow.
Random facts. There you go.
Yeah. Dog walking business. I love that. I can't tell you how many times I was tempted to do something like that when I was in a job that was unpleasant.
Doesn't it sound so perfect? It's like you're outside all day. You're with dogs that are awesome. And you can just maybe have a little time to just figure it out or think. But yeah, it was so counter to what I was doing. And I was just in this like, screw it state. So.
Oh yeah, I've been there.
Yeah.
Wow. That is something I wouldn't have known about you. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
And we're probably going to come back to those, especially the dog walking conversation, because it definitely was a pivotal moment for you. But let's start a little bit by, if you could describe just briefly what you do and about it.
Yeah. So the quick and dirty is that I write bios for a living. And so, but it's not that traditional bio. There's something egregiously wrong with those things. And so that's kind of, it was almost I feel like I'm in this war against those things, those really formalized pieces of paper that are supposed to say something about us, and they're supposed to qualify us for for certain jobs or to get people to like us, to get clients. And they miss anything important really about someone, which is kind of that essence or that little bit that you would get from them after learning a little bit about their story, so to speak. And so when I say bio writer, there's a narrative, there's storytelling components, but I always hesitate to use the word storytelling because then people think, oh, I don't need that. I'm not, or if you're a speaker, you think, yeah, I do need that. But storytelling, tell your story, that's this overused, tattered mantra that people are just saying when they don't know what it means and they don't know the work that goes into something like that. So
preach it, Caroline. Oh my gosh, you are speaking my language.
Yeah, I figured. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you did yours in video format, and that's what I saw, right?
Yes, there is a written form that's on my website, and it's the same bio. There were a little bit of adjustments made just because when you use a different medium, video, it's going to, certain things are either omitted just for the sake of time or just for the sake of lacking the visual or whatever. And so, yes, and that's a whole other story, how I even got to do that, because that wasn't really on my radar, so to speak. But yes, I have a really amazing video that it narrates my bio. And so I always say that your bio should be so good you can make a short film out of it, because you can. And I think that could be the litmus test right there for me. So.
No kidding. Well, let's get back to this whole storytelling thing, because you clearly could hear in my voice and understand my frustration with the overuse of your storytelling as a buzzword.
Right.
Where do you see that the most, where it's most egregious?
I see it the most. People often will tell I call it the I almost died but didn't story. Where,
yes.
Yeah, they when you say tell your story, it sounds like it needs to be this really epic thing, like you've had this wild and crazy life, or you almost drowned, you got diagnosed with something scary, and then the lesson, of this, the moral of the story is always, then I learned that I needed to appreciate life more. It's got this really generic, wimpy moral that we walk away with, and it feels dirty. It just feels like a manipulation, And then here's another thing that is usually coupled with that same, in that same scenario of the I almost died but didn't story, is that maybe we learned it if we went to journalism school or something, but start with the action. And so people will dump you in the middle of this gory scene, the train wreck or the whatever. And that again is it's manipulative. And so we have these tactics that we've learned work, and they're so disingenuous, and the reader can feel it, and they're automatically turned off. And I feel I know what people need to be doing is, first of all, telling their real story, or something that is probably more relevant to what they do than the time that they almost died. I mean, I almost died one time, but I don't tell that story because it just isn't the story that
defines you.
I needed to tell that story,
Right.
Yeah. And so you need to handle whatever the story is with way more respect than that. And so it really feels disrespectful when it feels embellished, or like I said, manipulative. Or if you don't, sometimes people kind of resist the urge to get to the meat of the matter, and then the most important part of the story gets swept under the rug. And so there's different ways that we don't do it service. And so So that's mostly what I notice out there.
It's funny you say that, the big I almost died story, because I created a meme around that. It said, your stories don't have to be epic, they have to be meaningful.
Right.
And
Yes.
that's the whole point. And what I find too, and this is in my book that's going to be available for pre-order here pretty soon, is that people not only see only the epic stories in terms of wanting to share them, but if you say, tell me about yourself, or tell me a story about yourself, they make it like your life is one long linear experience.
Right.
I was born in Washington, D.C. And then when I was 5, I moved to Denver. And then when I was 8, I moved, whatever. And they miss, again, the most important aspects of what happened in their lives, the things that really shaped them, those pivotal events that shaped them,
Right.
get lost
Right.
in that big, long, linear discussion or conversation, if you even want to call it that, about tell me about yourself. So I like to dig in. And when somebody says, tell me about yourself, I'll tell a story about some incident that happened when I was pregnant many years ago, or a very specific thing that happened recently that demonstrates who I am in a really clear way.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I try and kind of illustrate that sometimes on my email list, and tell a story. Like, I'm working on a piece right now where I was just sitting in a restaurant and there's a couple of really funny things going on. Like, this guy has kicked his shoes off and he has these really kind of, yeah, like pointy, weird toes, because he's a senior man, and his feet have been crammed into these old, into dress shoes his whole life. And his wife, he's sitting there with his wife, and they're having a conversation over whether or not like gorgonzola and blue cheese are the same thing. And there's yeah, and so there's all these little details of what's going on, and there's a bigger point that has to do with essentially writing at the end. And it's not a long piece. It's not like I have to start with entering the restaurant and then this happens and then this happens and then this happens. Mm-hmm. But it's these little details that shake out and create these really beautiful or strange moments that are important, and that if you write them in a compelling way, then it's fun and engaging to read.
It creates context for what's actually happening in the subcontext that you're not telling.
Right. And how that plays out in a bio, I always use the word story in air quotes, because we can tell your story in 2 or 3 sentences. We can grasp so much about you just by knowing that you used to be a workaholic and there was rotting takeout in your fridge all the time. Just those little details. So that's a part of the story that sets us up for a bigger message that's there. So
yes, and we do that every day, and realize that if we were more conscious of the stories we're sharing and how we're sharing them, that we could communicate better.
Right.
And of course, communicating better means improving our relationships, no matter where you're talking about. It could be with the mailman or the checker at the grocery store.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting. I was just thinking about something to that effect, and how relationship might not even be something, might not even be with a person, or it might not even be a direct exchange. But when you are observing something, then you are kind of interacting with it, and you're observing it rather than judging it. And so I think that seems like kind of the purest relationships, right, that you could have, is if you're just in them and participating and watching them and observing them, rather than rating them or judging them or trying
creating some narrative around it that doesn't necessarily exist because you can't know.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Right. Well, maybe that's an answer to judgment and bias and racism and all of the issues that we're dealing with right now is that um, teaching people and helping them create a strategy around observation and storytelling as opposed to judgment and narrative.
Right. Yes,
Hmm.
that would be part of it. Yeah. Yeah, and
Ooh,
it
that
gives
gives some ideas.
say that again.
I said, that gives me some ideas.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I know, right?
Hmm.
I love I was listening to Russell Brand the other day, and I forget the guy that he had on, but he's one of my favorite podcasters, and they were I mean, and this subject comes up a lot. It's just how there's kind of no nuance, like you really have to pick a side, like you're either this or you're that, you know, you identify as this or you identify as that, you know, you're blue or red, whatever. And like there's no flux, there's no room for nuance, there's no gray area, and I think it is just driving us all crazy. So
Mm-hmm. Totally agree. When you said something about your email newsletter and incorporating a story to model what you're describing,
yeah.
somebody I know is doing a really good job with that as well. His name is Robert Downs, and he's a photographer out of LA.
Oh, cool.
And I get his email. Yeah, I get his email, and it's not regular. It doesn't come every week or every month, but when it does, it's always a story. And I love the way he shares kind of how he became a photographer.
Yeah.
And it's little incidents. It's not, oh, I decided I wanted to be a photographer and I went to school and I did this and I did that. It's
Right.
this pivotal time when his dad gave him his first camera, or because his dad was a journalist, and so he took him with him
Right.
on these, going to see what was happening, the news that was being made at that moment. And he's kind of magical with his words, and he doesn't even know it. He has no idea really what he's doing in terms of engaging the audience and making us feel connected to him. I'm sure he doesn't know.
Right. Yeah, he probably doesn't know. That reminds me of, and it kind of tips back to that other subject we were having, or that other conversation we were having about an epic life versus a non-epic life. But someone said to me once, some people have these really amazing epic stories to tell, and some people have regular lives but have a really beautiful way of looking at them. And that's why paying attention to your language and the words that you're using around just any everyday thing is sort of painting the picture of your life. And so this guy that you're talking about, he has this way of seeing things, and it probably, I don't know what comes first, like the chicken or the egg. Like if you do you assert the language that changes it, or are you actually experiencing it differently and then wording it in such a way? But for me, I know that it's when I go back to write something that I can see it a little bit more in a more tantalizing way than I did in the moment.
In the moment. Right. Right. And I think it's part of what makes him such a good photographer, because he captures the story that's happening at that moment.
Right.
And
Yeah.
what's interesting, particularly interesting about what you just said, is that when we take the time to process something that happened and then write about it, we're giving ourselves an opportunity to shift the story internally. And I've been reading a researcher out of Western Washington University, Kate McLean, and she is asserting that the stories we share and how we share them actually create our sense of self.
Right.
So it's as far as her research is concerned, it's not a chicken and egg. It's actually the stories that you're telling,
right,
and how you tell them, that create your sense of self and your identity. It basically creates your personality. And Christian Jarrett's been writing about that as well, out of the UK. And that to me is totally fascinating. And it's part of why I wanted to talk to you, not just as a bio writer, but because of the story you share in that mini film that you created, or that was created around your bio.
Yeah.
So if you don't mind, I'd like to kind of transition into that part of the conversation, which is endurance running.
Yeah.
What was the moment? I mean, what was the experience that you think triggered that drive, that motivation to do what you do in terms of endurance running?
To run. I was a really wimpy kid. I joke, but I'm also kind of serious that I say I was just like a sugar crack baby. I just lived off of sugar and junk food as a kid. So I had migraine headache starting in the 5th grade, and was just kind of like a emaciated, like pale, kid. And so, I mean, I'm making it sound like I was sickly. I was also outside all the time and, playing around and stuff. But it was like junior high where I was like, there's something wrong, with this. And so for whatever reason, there was a stop sign down at the end of my road, and I remember what it was. It was the presidential physical fitness tests, and and you're supposed to do the 7-minute mile, and but there were some kids that could do it, and I couldn't do it. And so anyway, I started running down to the end of the stop sign and back, and that was like my run starting in junior high. And I just like went from there. And back then, when I was running in the era that I was kind of writing about in that video, it was very Forrest Gumpy. Like it was like I was running and I didn't come back until I was like wringing out my sports bra. And it would be like 2 and 3 hours. I don't know how far I was going. I would guess like at least a half marathon every time I went out. I was exhausted. I was in college and running like that, and was exhausted all the time because I didn't really know anything about proper nutrition or like what I was doing, but it was just this need. I mean, I think I got pretty addicted to the endorphins and just the zen of it. But yeah.
On that first run, you're imagining yourself running to that stop sign and back. I could see it in your face that you're imagining yourself running to that stop sign. Like you could see it in your mind's eye.
Yeah.
Do you remember afterward? Like what? Do you remember afterward? Like when you'd get home after doing this back and forth?
Yeah.
Do you remember kind of what whoever you were living with at that time? Do you remember kind of any interactions after that shifted things?
I remember. No, I don't remember. I mean, my family. It was kind of one of those families where the kids were a little bit raising themselves, too busy adults, and it was also like the 80s, and so that's what we did. You know what I mean? It wasn't like we were just raised a little differently back then. And so yeah, there was no one that was really even aware of what I was doing, I don't think. And so, but I remember not feeling good afterwards because I just that was a long way to run, like there and back. I think it was a half a mile. And so, and again, I'm in junior high. I mean, maybe that's a long distance, for someone that young. But I just remember my heroes were Indiana Jones and Edward Furlong's mom and Terminator 2. And so I wanted very much to be strong. And so, yeah. That was just the impetus right there. So.
It's funny you say that because you just popped an image into my head. I think it was Terminator 2 when the opening view of her is she's doing pull-ups
yes.
in her prison room.
Yes.
And you just brought up this distinct memory of when I saw that the first time and thinking, oh, I want to look like that. I want arms like that. Like yes. She was so strong, and all I could think was, nobody's going to mess with you if you look like that. You don't have to know how to fight,
right?
Because nobody's going to pick a fight with you if you have that kind of physique and
Yeah.
that kind of attitude. And that's actually when I started lifting. I got into powerlifting after I saw that movie. I was like, oh my gosh, I want to be super strong like that. It was a combination of things. I had been, there was an attempt at an assault on me. I had had a party, it was in high school, and this boy came in when there was no one else around and had me on the floor. And I got my knee up in time to not have been molested in that way. But it definitely made me realize how delicate I was, because I'm tiny. I was under 5 feet tall at that point. I graduated from high school and then grew almost 2 inches my freshman year of college, which is just bizarre for a girl. But I was under 5 feet tall and under 100 pounds. And so I realized at that moment when I was on the floor, it was right after my senior year, that that I was a target.
Yes.
That there was nothing I could do. I was just lucky that I happened to have my wits about me and be able to get my knee up in the right place at the right time.
Yes.
And I saw that movie and I was totally inspired. I was like, nobody's going to mess with me if I have that physique. And that was a pivotal moment for me too, seeing the image of this woman powerful.
Yes. Yeah. Saving the world. And that's so interesting because I've just never admitted that to people, like that she was such an inspiration, like that clip in the film. But that's cool. It probably hit more people than us. So
it's when I asked my parents for a chin-up bar, the ones that would go over the door frame where, it hooks up over the door frame, and I got one. And by the end of that summer, I was able to do at least 3 or 4 chin-ups.
Hell yeah. My dad had a solo flex, and I worked out on that thing too. And like was hanging upside down, doing like the sit-ups that way. And absolutely. Yeah. Lifting as well as running. And I need to do this, write an article about this, because I know, it's probably easy for me to say, but like women focus on weight loss. And I've heard them say things like, in the past, maybe they don't say this anymore, but like I don't want to get bulky. And like when you feel strong in your upper body, I don't know. I mean, you might not be able to take down some big, just crazy man, let's say, if you were attacked, but you posture differently in the world when you feel strong. And so I don't know, I think you're putting out I'm not saying that if anything does happen to you that it's your fault because you weren't putting out some kind of vibe. I'm not saying one thing by saying another. I just mean that you walk in the world differently when you feel strong.
Oh, of course, it changes your posture.
Yeah.
And it definitely changes the confidence that you're exuding, and it makes you less of a target.
Right.
It
and
just
even
does.
If you're athletes, it's like, well, if I needed to like run to Bend, Oregon from here, like I could. If the apocalypse happens and I need to go to my brother's house, whatever, I just, when you feel strong, it feels good to feel strong. That's it. So.
It does. I totally agree. And I continue to do that. I had a pivotal moment just maybe 3 years ago. I think it was about 45. And I had climbed to the top of the mountain behind my house. And for some reason decided I was going to jog back down.
Yeah.
And just climbing up is a workout. And because it's a mountain, it's just getting up there is a workout. And I got up there pretty fast that day. And I remember feeling pretty fit at that point. And then I remember jogging back down and kind of jumping over little rocks and trip hazards and getting faster, and sometimes having to slow down so I wouldn't slide, but just kind of getting faster. And then I'd go down a little decline and then go up an incline and just power through it. And I'm not a runner. Just as a little caveat here, I have never been a runner. I've done weightlifting. I'm a hiker. I'm outdoorsy. I love to fly fish and can hike and climb rocks, but I am not a runner.
Right.
So that being said, when I would power through that next incline and get to the top of the hill and maybe stop there and drink some water or just keep on jogging. And then I'd get back home. And I remember one time in particular, as I powered through that next uphill and I could feel my shin splints start to happen, which is part of why I haven't been a runner.
Yeah.
And I remember this sudden realization that I was fit, that I wasn't comparing myself to anyone else in that moment. I wasn't thinking, was my mom like this when she was 45? Because that thought had passed my head many times before. But in that moment, it was all about where I was in that moment. And I felt so strong. And you're right. There was a power in that moment that now when I look back, I realize where that came from. And I'm so grateful for this body that I have that can get me to where I need to be.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. We are lucky to have to be able-bodied.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So back to your pivot points. Can you think of any in particular, especially when you left your other job to become a dog walker?
Uh-huh.
Do you remember what it was that triggered that? So let me back up a little bit. When I talk about pivot points, that light bulb moment where everything shifts, I don't necessarily believe that a light switch just flips on and you suddenly have this light bulb moment. I really believe it's more, and it starts with different incidents that build up to the light bulb moment.
Right.
I like to hear of the light bulb moment, and then kind of sometimes I'll be able to go back and we'll identify the other lead up moments to that. But so that's what I'm asking for. Do you remember that light bulb moment?
For quitting the job, it's such a loaded question because I would say that probably from mid-20s on, there has been, not so much anymore, thank the universe, but like, I'm talking, people talk about having existential crisis or having a quarter life crisis, like that one time they had a quarter life crisis. And I'm just like, wow, I've had like 100, I feel like. And so, so just kind of a perpetual state of like, what is going on? What am I doing? And I feel like that's because sometimes I'm just at odds with the way that capitalism works and like everything works. And so I think it's hard for people like me sometimes. And so that's a whole other can of worms. But so anyway, I'm participating in society, right? Going in, working at a job, in a cube, behind a desk. I'm in the marketing department, right? And it just, I had at least one like full blown, I guess, panic attack. I hate to use that phrase at work because it was like, is this it? Like, is this what we're doing here for
more of a meltdown, you think? I think those are different things, a meltdown versus a panic attack. I think they're kind of different things, but
pick one. It didn't feel good. You know what I mean?
Okay.
So, yeah. And anyway, it was just kind of a feeling of dissatisfaction. And I stayed in that job for about 3 years because I loved my fellow employees. And I knew I had great managers. I knew it was a great place to work. But I just could not feel the excitement that other people felt for this type of thing. And so anyway, and it was kind of sexy. It was like a photography company, but it was also a lot of stock photography. And so that can be pretty lame. And so anyway, and this happens to me, and it happens to me, especially a lot when I was waiting tables, back throughout college and then some, where I would just get pushed to this point where I would do something really reckless and be like, screw it, I'm done, Like, I can't. And so anyway, yeah, it was just a lead up like that. And it was something, I had a dog, and I felt bad about my dog being home all the time by itself. A relationship ended, and the dog was pawned off on me. And I mean that literally, because like, it was not my dog, but anyway, I ended up with the dog. And so, yeah. And like I was saying earlier, it was just a moment of, this isn't fair to my manager, who is so good to me, is trying to help me. This isn't fair to me. This isn't fair. This sucks. And I gotta do something different. And so, yeah, I had taken this course, like puppy. We went to puppy school with this dog when it was a puppy, and so I knew these people, and so I reached out to them, and anyway, kind of got some basics under my belt. I didn't know anything about running a business, and took this leap with my savings. And I mean, I say that now, and that was really risky. I always kind of hesitate to have this conversation with like any other adults that could be listening, to people that are more logical than I can be sometimes. But yeah, that's the gist of it. Right.
Do you remember your first day dog walking?
No, I just remember certain clients, how I think about this, how strange it is to go into other people's homes and just to feel like you've opened the door on a different universe. When you go to work every day at an office, at a nice, clean, crisp, sexy office, and versus when you creep into people's houses while they're at work to work their dogs and kind of see their afterlife, their after work hours life. And so anyway, it was like this drastic environmental change, and kind of working people on a very intimate level, which you wouldn't think it would be. And you're just walking their dog, but you go into their homes, and you're getting the scoop on their dog, and you're feeling the guilt they have around having their dogs home all day. And anyway, it's pretty intense, actually.
Did any of them really surprise you, where you met the person and then you saw their house and you're like, holy cow, that is not what I expected?
Oh, like every single person. Because people who can afford to have their dogs walked are people that are doing all right, in a lot of ways, and they're professionals because they're busy. They don't have time for their dogs, at least during the week. And you go into their homes, and sometimes it's like chaos. They've got a dog that is like old and sleeps with them and poops a little bit in the bed, and ramps jerry-rigged to the bed, or just clutter. And some people's homes are so pristine, and like they've got their dogs are eating raw diets because they're gonna poop all over the house if they don't do this. And so some people's lives become really rigid because they're trying to accommodate this dog. And some people's lives just become a total wreck because they're accommodating this dog, or it was a wreck anyway. And anyway, yeah, I was always surprised at what was going on behind the door.
Wow. I bet she has some really good stories. One of these days we're going to dig into those.
Yeah. Okay.
Because I'm going to want to hear more. I want specifics.
Yeah, got some.
It made me think of a TV show my husband and I have been guiltily watching. It's one of those guilty pleasure TV shows. It's called Dead Like Me. And it's a 18-year-old girl who dies in a freak accident and becomes a Grim Reaper. So she takes the souls out of people's bodies right as they're dying. And one of the things that is so interesting about the story is that they don't get paid for this, but they have to live among the living. They're kind of undead living among the living, which is such a silly concept. But
Right.
basically, they have to find a place to live, because they're living among the living.
Right.
And at a few times, the person that ends up dying in the show is not well known, or no family shows up or whatever. And so they just take over that apartment or that house and live in it
Yes.
after the person dies, because there's no one who's going to know the difference. And so when you were talking about that, I was visualizing one of the episodes where they walk into this house that is, formerly owned by a woman that was an actress in like the 30s or something like that, and seeing how this person lived in their lives.
Yes.
And having those stories. And again, we come right back to the beginning of our conversation about stories being observation and not judgment.
Right.
And that's, and I'm imagining now going into these homes of recently dead people and really observing how they lived without judgment and how hard that would be.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, that sounds like a really fantastic show, first of all. Like, I love the whole concept. So,
well, I don't know about fantastic, but it is definitely entertaining, and I'm enjoying it because I have enough reality in my life. Sometimes I like to watch shows that have zero basis in reality, or read books, novels that have zero basis in reality.
Right. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Yeah. Guilty pleasures.
Yeah. You gotta have some of those.
Yeah. So I'm guessing that you have some really good stories about that, and that you probably use that power of observation from your experiences of dog walking. How long did you do that?
Not long. It didn't last long, but I would say a year, maybe.
Oh, yeah. So you went into a lot of people's houses.
Well, I had a lot of consistent clients. Yeah. And then I was also, taking them to the park, and was trying to get into like staying the night at people's houses. Like, that's a whole other thing that you can charge more for. I'm trying to remember. And so it's a networky kind of tight knit thing. You need to find your clients that are that client that can obviously pay, but also really needs it and is really busy. And kind of work within that small network. Or at least that was my model. So, yeah.
So have you used that experience, or can you, I don't know if you know until you start really thinking about it, so we may not get an answer in the next few minutes, but do you think you use that experience in your storytelling strategies and think back on those individuals that you interacted with that are more vivid in your memory? Do you think about those things?
Yeah, I think about them a lot, and I'm an essayist, I guess. And so I think a lot about when I have a prompt or something like that. And this is kind of an aside from bios, but, so if you're working with a literary piece, some creative nonfiction or whatever, then you're always, it's so weird what the things that you dip into, that you hadn't thought about in a long time, or you're writing on a subject that has to do with this doctor that you once know, and that somehow goes into this fellow employee that you used to work with, and then all of a sudden you're talking about your dad, and like all these things
right.
like tip backwards and like domino effect. And so the dog walking customers, there is one that's popped up in a piece of writing, but you never know when that material is going to come in handy. And so, and I try and use a lot of that stuff, or I'm thinking about using it more in blog posts, but at the same time, there's a part of me that cherishes it a lot and would rather it live in a more, I don't know, literary world. And so anyway, I'm kind of always like, oh, maybe I'm going to use that for something else, but I also think that I could use it as much as I want to. So,
yes, I think that's something that people forget. So they don't pay attention to those older stories until they need them, as opposed to every once in a while just kind of going back and having almost like a Rolodex of stories in your head, or even index cards as a memory comes up, just kind of jotting down a few words and then putting it away so that you can come back to it later. And it's not just for writers. I think it's really important for us to kind of create this portfolio or Rolodex of stories so that we have them when we need them to connect with somebody, that we find something in common with them. Right. And I was just talking about this with a friend of mine, that I'm always surprised that people don't have more small world stories.
Right.
Because they're so common, but why doesn't everybody have dozens of them like I do? Right. I could come up with 5 just off the top of my head of really strange coincidence where I ran into somebody who knows somebody else, or you know what I mean, those small world stories.
Yeah.
And I think the key to that is that people don't ask those questions that draw out those stories. Right. And so they don't know where the connection is. And there's always a connection.
Yes, I believe that too. There is always a connection. And yeah, I mean, I think if you're a writer or an artist of some kind, then you're probably, dipping into that territory a little more than if you weren't. But I also think people are so busy. It's almost like you don't get time to stop and think. I was in a class with someone one time who went and did a silent retreat, and she was talking about I forget how many days in she was to the retreat, but memories started coming back to her, and she was amazed. And so now I want to do it. Never really had a desire to go somewhere and not talk and meditate for days, but I mean, kind of a little bit. But the idea of of just kind of accessing things that have happened and being able to see it again because you kind of have some space, that sounds really appealing. And I probably have more space than a lot of people, and so just because I do write and because I live alone and I don't have kids and I don't have animals anymore, you know what I mean? And so, yeah.
But do you give yourself that space, which I think is a totally different thing. You may have it.
Yeah.
But do you grace yourself with it? Probably not as much as you want to or could.
Yeah, or if I did it less with the thinking of work around it,
Right.
So
giving your space with more intention to actually leave that space open.
Right.
Yeah, I know. I'm bad about that as well. But I do find that because of the work that I do as a coach, I'm often uncovering those stories with people. Right. And because sometimes they need an example of a story, and I can think of one off the top of my head, it draws out their stories. And then I get to dive a little deeper into my own experience related to it. Right. Obviously not in that moment, because it always drives me crazy when you're telling a story and you can tell that at some point in the beginning of your story, you lost your audience because they're thinking of their own story. Right. And they're just waiting for their turn. That drives me a little crazy.
Yes.
But again, as we kind of loop back to the beginning of the conversation, when we think of our lifestyle and pinpoint specific things that are uniquely our own, and that would have to be related to a story, right. Then we can tell our story in a way that's compelling and encourages connection.
Right. Yes, totally. Yeah, and I would add, and I don't even, this is just a thought that popped in my head, is sometimes it helps to stand back and take a really, really, really broad view of the stories, or just like, what have you been up to in general? You know what I mean? For vast amounts of time. And you can kind of see a little wisp of a thread, and then you can kind of start to zero in, and that's how with the running story, actually I do all kinds of sports. Now I'm even more of a cyclist, but the point wasn't to like list all the sports that I've been into, right? There's like an endurance theme. And so, and in sports has always felt like something that's been in contradiction with writing to me, like if I'm not out there running, if I'm writing, then I want to be running or cycling or moving, and if I'm out there doing that, then I want to be home and working on something and sitting and thinking.
I could see that contradiction. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm not saying that we don't exist, but like, I don't, like my writer friends aren't typically athletes, and my athlete friends aren't typically, people that have sedentary hobbies, and so there is kind of a little bit of a friction there at times. And so it was when I was thinking about those things and then started to see them as two parallels. And I say in the bio, writing is an endurance sport because it is in a lot of ways. And so anyway, that's when that's where a theme kind of came through. And then I was able to kind of focus in on certain details. And so
that is so,
yeah.
Wow. I love what you just said there. Finding that theme.
Yeah. And I'm sure, we all have lots of themes, but this, for me, and I can't speak for everybody, but if you think about like kind of areas of your life that are kind of, there's like some friction or some tension there, you'll see that, that maybe not, maybe there is a parallel there, or maybe there's a story there, maybe there's a theme there. So.
I'm going to have to be thinking about this for a while. I'm really glad we're recording this conversation because I'm going to want to listen to it. Because I know there are nuances in here that I am missing as I'm listening to your story.
Yeah.
Awesome. Caroline, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. This has been so full of insights, and ideas are popping in my head. It's going to take me a couple days to start jotting things down and really think about where some of this conversation could go in terms of writing and networking and storytelling.
Yes, totally. I will think about it too. And this has been like maybe the most fun conversation I've had on a podcast. So,
Oh, yay.
Yeah, it's really fun to dig into like the meaty stuff. And so, yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you. And for our listeners, there will be a blog post associated with this podcast on the elkinsconsulting.com website, where you can learn a little bit more about Caroline, and I'll have a link to her video as well as her website, and you can maybe connect with her on LinkedIn. So there will be information to connect with Caroline on the blog post associated with this podcast. Thanks, Caroline.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Your Stories Don't Define You, but How You Tell Them Will. Are you ready to explore your own stories to find your patterns and pivot points? You can do that with my new book, which is now available for pre-order. Your story isn't a timeline of experiences. Your story is each individual incident, conversation, and event that made an impact on how you think and how you see the world around you. This book will help you identify those incidents, helping you create a story portfolio to refer to as you choose which personal stories to tell and how to tell them. And when you can look back at that portfolio and find the patterns in your life, you can address many of the internal messages and communication challenges that are limiting your success at work and in your relationships. Visit my pre-order site on publishizer.com. Click on Proposals and search for Sarah Elkins or Your Stories Don't Define You. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com. me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away?